All right, Colossians. This morning what I want to do is mostly an intro to Colossians and talk a little bit about, contextually what was happening in that area, a little bit about Paul. Paul is the writer of Colossians, and also just some of the common themes and things that we should be thinking about as we go through this study this quarter. In a lot of ways, Colossians is thought to have been a study of remembrance. And so Paul is writing to the church in Colossae and is wanting them to remember. And it reminds me of the words in Genesis chapter 9, 14 through 16, when God says, "When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." And so that is a statement, a promise to remember. And, a lot of times if we can create the habit and the discipline of remembering and apply that to our everyday walk, the hardest part is over if we can just remember. And so that's really what Paul is wanting to place upon the people of and the church there at Colossae. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, which is just chock full of quotes that we use all the time, he said in that book, "People need to be reminded more often than they need to be instructed." When you have something as simple as the gospel and the deity of God and the commandments and the covenant and the promise of God, it really is just a matter of remembering. And sometimes, much like the people in Colossians, we forget our place when it comes to the relationship we have with Jesus. And that was really what Paul wanted to stress upon them is, they are a church, they are a congregation, and nothing is above Jesus. And the relationship that they were to have with Jesus could not be compared with anything else. And so that is another common theme that we'll find as we study this quarter in Colossians. I think we struggle with this sometimes as well in our walk. We get caught in the trap of mixing Jesus in with everything else. One of the books I'm using was talking about this and said that this behavior, the idea is kind of a Jesus plus fill-in-the-blank idea, which means that, so many times we think that our walk here on earth is just a mixture of what Jesus wants for us and then everything else. On Sundays it might be Jesus plus Sunday lunch, because that's a tradition, right, that you may have in your family. That's a really big deal. Sometimes it's Jesus plus doing good, or Jesus plus family, or Jesus plus whatever. And those are all good things, the things sometimes that we add to our Christian walk and how we kind of create our hierarchies. The things that we're mixing in are all good things sometimes. But if we really think of Jesus as just part of the formula in our Christian walk, then we've got it all wrong. And that's in a lot of ways what the Colossians were doing. What we'll find Paul stress in this letter is that he doesn't want the people of Colossae to think about, Jesus combined with something else, or mixing their religious walk into Jesus and the laws and the customs of the land, or Jesus and this kind of deep religious thinking philosophically. What Paul was really pushing the people there is Jesus should be above all. Jesus is it. You don't need anything else but Jesus Jesus is the way to the Father. And so we'll really talk a lot about that and try to put ourselves in the shoes, or I guess the sandals of the people of Colossae, and think about, how hard it would have been in first century, ripping yourselves away from all the cultural pressures and really just focusing on Jesus. In some ways, that's going to be hard for us to do. In other ways, that's not very hard for us to think about being in their place. We struggle with the same things today. We try to balance out, our belief system with our family, or college football, or whatever it is that we love and really want to do. And sometimes we get distracted with putting Jesus first. So the book of Colossians is a reminder to us as to what the appropriate relationship really is with Jesus. When we'll find here that the Colossians were specifically being pressured to pay more attention to the law and not abandon Jewish traditions. They weren't placing themselves in subject just to Jesus. They felt like they had to follow the commandments and the covenant of Jesus, but also continue to follow the commandments of men as well. And that's, in a lot of ways, what they were struggling with. Let's look real quick as we kind of begin to wrap our head around this book of Colossians, this letter. Let's see kind of the back and forth. I'll give you some examples of some of the regulations that were placed in Paul, as Paul describes what was happening to the Colossians, the regulations that were placed on them, and then Paul's response. Our first example is around food, drink, a festival, or even keeping the Sabbath. Let's look at chapter 2, verse 16. It says, "Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath." If you don't put that in context, then you might just pass on by that passage where Paul is giving them this instruction. But what the Colossians were dealing with was really a ton of pressure to keep up these customs. And so they were caught trying to balance out and walk the line in what the Jewish customs were, and also be a Christian, be a member of the church. So in verses 14, 15, and 17, Paul talks about this some more as he creates a contrast to that. Let's look at verse 14. He's talking about Jesus and says, "By canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands, this he set aside, nailing it to the cross." Don't you love that phrase that we use a lot of times ourselves? Being able to nail something to the cross. It is a blessing that we can take the old law and just the idea of legalism or living by strict commandments and strict customs and just nail it to the cross. What does that mean whenever we say nail it to the cross? What does that mean to you? Somebody muttered something. Do away with it, right? It also means that Jesus carried all those things with him up on the cross, right? We sometimes forget that Jesus' resurrection, his death and his resurrection was a victory. And it was the introduction of a new covenant. And so with that, a lot of things changed. So when Jesus was put up on that cross, he allowed himself to be put up on that cross, and he also carried a lot of things with him. And as his body was destroyed and beaten, so were those items that were nailed up on the cross. And so Paul is talking about that here in verse 14. The debt that stood against them and the legal demands. The demands that the the people here in Colossae were dealing with, Paul's saying, forget about all that stuff. It was nailed to the cross. As Jesus changed everything, that changed too. Yeah, go ahead.
To me, brings up the idea that this is something specific. It's not just a random event that happens. We took that and we made a special purpose to nail that up, if you will, in our lives of, hey, that's complete, it's done. It had a special meaning.
Yeah.
I think that goes back to being nailed to the cross here. This was something very, very specific for the Christian people.
That's a really good point. If you didn't hear Jim was saying, all of the things that changed, I'm just going to phrase it a little differently, all the things that were changed were tangible. There wasn't just kind of this, feely type, soft change that happened. It's a lot like when Moses went up on the mountain and came down with a new covenant or a book of laws. That was an abrupt change to the Israelites, right? Well, when Jesus went up on the tree, that was an abrupt change for us. We're still living under that covenant, that new way of getting to God. It was representative of a new path to God. And Paul is trying to kind of slap the people of Colossae and say, hey, this was a big change. This was something very new. Look at verse 15. He goes on to say, he disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. Jim's comment about something very specific, something very tangible is really good. Paul here is being very pointed in what he's talking about. He's talking about the rulers and authorities, putting them to shame and triumphing over them. I always like to think about, we're going to talk about how they received this letter from Paul here in just a moment. But I always like to think about the open reading of Paul's letters to the congregation, or I don't know how all that was done, but I like to kind of put myself in that place and just think about it. I wonder if some people just kind of shrunk down in their seat in this part of the letter, right? Because Paul's basically he's saying, remember, which is kind of one of our big themes here in our study, and he's talking about the rulers and authorities and putting them to shame, probably the same personality types that the Christians there in Colossae were struggling with, that were really pushing the people there to do these customs and to think and to work in these ways, and kind of mixing the idea of Jesus in with everything else, are these same personality types that are rulers and authorities. And again, Paul is saying that's all done away with. There is no hierarchy here. There's just one. Look at verse 17. This is the last passage here of the contrast between regulations that were imposed and things that Christians were not bound to. Verse 17. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. So all of these things were taken away. They were nailed to the cross. They were just a shadow of future practices, and they were imposed by evil forces that basically still wanted control. This is a control issue, and the people of Colossae were in the middle of it. All right, let's look at another regulation, another rule that the Colossians were dealing with, and then let's contrast that again to things that the Christians weren't bound to. Let's look at verse 18. It says, "Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind." And this idea of asceticism, who has something else besides that? Anybody have a different version you're reading from? Okay, self-abasement. That's a little more, I had to look up asceticism, just to be honest with you. But self-abasement is just this idea of self-discipline, beating upon oneself, I guess both emotionally and physically sometimes. They were dealing with regulations around that. They were dealing with things like worship of angels or visions that were seen, that sort of thing. And so that was part of their culture. And you could see why this would take away from Christ and putting Christ first and foremost and nothing else. This idea of physical things, again, worshiping of angels, that subtracts from Christ, right? And so later on in verse 18, the verse that we just read, it says, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind. And then in verse 19, you see the other side of it. What Paul is really pushing the Christians there to believe, not holding fast to the head. Who would the head be? Who do we know as the head? Jesus, right? We're the body. Not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with the growth that is from God. That's not what I'm proposing as the key verse in Colossians. We'll look at that here in just a moment too. But that's a really good verse, right, to kind of, as you think about, as we define the problem, which was the Christians weren't just focused on Christianity and Christ, they were focused on everything that was mixed up in it. Paul here is really creating that divide and saying, you've got to hold fast to the head. It's how the whole body is put together. Without the head, you don't have a complete body. That is the church. And so Paul, again, is using that kind of personification of the church to say that Christ is at the top of this whole thing. Without Christ, it doesn't work. Let's look at one other example of contrast. We'll look at verses 20 and 21. If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. And so, again, same theme here, but Paul is getting even more kind of tactical in this and saying, all this stuff is behind you. Why are you letting people kind of push you around through the laws of religion that don't apply anymore? And he gives some really simple examples there, but he's kind of getting on to them about submitting themselves to regulations. And so in verses 22 and 23, he counteracts that with how Christians are not bound. Verse 22, referring to things that all perish as they are used according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. I love how he describes the last part of all those attempts. These do no good in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. Why do you think that is? How do you use things that are kind of carnal themselves to counteract the indulgence of the flesh? It doesn't work. And so Paul is really pushing on them and saying, these human precepts and teachings are not going to keep you pure. They're not going to set you apart. It's all in vain in trying to do these things. And so that's the last kind of counter thought that Paul has, and it kind of really gives you the situation as to what's happening in Colossae. It's kind of like a tug of war between where they're coming from and where they need to be. And so Paul is pushing them in this way.
Mackenzie, I like
Go ahead.
the section there that says promoting self-made religion. We have a lot of that goes on in our current time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a part in here where I wanted to kind of ask you all how you see our relationship with what the Colossians were dealing with. And I think you're right, Jimmy. I think there is a pretty close connection there.
There's groups meeting all around this morning that have come up with their own rules
Yeah.
for what religion should do and shouldn't do.
Yeah.
And it's based on this religion, not scripture.
Yeah, and I think I don't know 100%, but it seems like to me that at this time things were a little more apparent, I guess not as sneaky. The thing that they struggled with was coming from something to something, and they were kind of in between of all of it. But all of the rules and regulations, I kind of even picture them all being kind of written down or something handed down by families, that sort of thing. Or they were just living under the old law and some of this and kind of stretched different things in different ways. Now it's not as transparent, in what we deal with. The idea of religion is kind of dissipated, and it's not as clear to us whenever we're really letting something own us in kind of this regulatory way over our relationship with Christ. Other thoughts? This is a really good connection to what we deal with. Kevin?
It sort of leads over where people say, I don't need the church. I have my own religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Real popular now, We don't
Yeah.
have to collectively meet as the church, and that's violation of Scripture there. But,
Yeah.
like Jimmy was saying, they make up their own rules as they go to satisfy their needs at particular time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, that verse we were looking at earlier where Paul talks about Christ as the head and we're the body and we're all, it's kind of like, well, what do you mean you don't need the church? You don't need Christ as the head? You don't need to be a part of a body? That doesn't sound very functional, That's a really good point. All right, let's look a little bit at the author, who we all know and love, and the date. So Paul, obviously, the kind of climax of Paul's life, it seems like, is in Acts 9 when he was on his way to Damascus. How did they get this letter? So I kind of referenced this earlier. And it's thought that the gospel was taken to Colossae by Epaphras. And so if you look at Acts 19, verse 10, you kind of see this general statement about the gospel being taken to all of Asia. 19:10. It says, this continued for 2 years, so that all the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks. And then if you change over to Colossians chapter 1, verse 7, Paul references Epaphras and says, just as you learned it from Epaphras, our beloved fellow servant, he is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf and has made known to us your love in the Spirit. And so we know that Epaphras brought them the gospel. And Paul, we're kind of assuming, but Paul is also sending Epaphras to write to them again in this letter, in this epistle. And Paul talks to them here about the grace of God and truth. And so, feel like Epaphras is bringing them the gospel and then the following letter. Most likely, Paul wrote Colossians in AD 60. in Rome whenever he was imprisoned. And it's also thought that Timothy, who was very close to Paul, we know, was likely the scribe, and Tychicus and Onesimus likely carried it there. If you look at Colossians chapter 4, verse 7, it says, Tychicus will tell you all about my activities. He is a beloved brother and faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord. I've sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are, and that he may encourage your hearts. And with Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you, they will tell you of everything that has taken place here. Okay, so they're kind of the messengers, the carriers. And we'll learn more about Onesimus as we move into Philemon, which, like I said, I think probably we'll end up studying some about Philemon as we move through the letter to the Colossians. We've already talked quite a bit about the situation, but just to make sure we're covering kind of behind the scenes what we feel like is happening, we could assume that Paul probably heard from Epaphras that the church in Colossae was growing. Seems like, in Paul's writing, he's not here talking about divisions like he was to the Corinthians. He's not talking about, the struggle that they may be dealing with and other aspects. So it feels kind of like they're growing in number, and from that perspective, things are going well. But he's more concerned about what he heard from Epaphras and this deceptive philosophy that we'll talk about here in a moment that has taken root. And it's almost as if, I gave Corinthians earlier as an example. In Corinth, Paul is writing to the Corinthians after a lot of things had happened. So there were literally people grouping up against each other. And so Paul is writing this reactive letter to the Corinthians and saying, I've heard these things. I hear about this. I hear about this. And so the context there is all reactive. Here, it's almost like Paul is writing a proactive letter to the Colossians and saying, I'm hearing these things from Epaphras. I'm hearing that you're struggling with these things, that different things are starting to creep in, and I want to proactively write this letter to ask you to remember. So you could kind of think of it that way. Again, the supremacy of Christ was challenged and was getting mixed up with Jewish laws and beliefs. And Paul really wanted to assure the Colossians that Jesus was to be first and foremost, and that he was counteracting those things that were creeping into the church there. This belief system that it's commonly thought that the Colossians were dealing with is called Gnosticism. And it's a belief that questions Jesus' lordship and supremacy. And it's basically almost like a melting pot of different belief systems. In fact, it's thought of to be made up of three different things. One, Jewish legalism. That was obviously passed down to them through families. Greek philosophy, and then Eastern mysticism. And, I tried to really, we've talked about Gnosticism before. Drew's talked about it quite a bit. Last night I was trying to wrap my hand around, specifically what are the tenets of Gnosticism. And it kind of explains once I got through a lot of the stuff I was looking at and reading, it explains the difficulty of Gnosticism, because it's hard to wrap your head or arms around, specifically what was going on and what was happening. At the root of it, intellect and knowledge, and like I mentioned earlier, mysticism was worshipped. It's this kind of ever-changing, ever-sliding around belief. And along with that, the supremacy of God and Christ was watered down in this thought process. And it goes against Jesus' teachings directly. So it's hard to be a Christian and also be pulled away from Gnosticism if you really understood what Jesus had to say about a Christian's relationship with Him and the Father. And in Matthew 6:33, part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, He said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you." That's a direct counteracting statement against the belief system behind Gnosticism. We cannot have a relationship with God is what they were really pushing, and it's the opposite of Christianity. This is what I was referencing earlier when I was talking about, how sometimes we, without even knowing it, create this formula in our own lives where, Christ is just a part of the formula. We face pressures ourselves to demote or eliminate our Savior's name in comparison to everything that we've got going on. And we talk about Gnostics in the first century, but, if you look back a century from today, you look back at our culture, what will they say about us? We know what in the latter part of the first century, we have proof as to what Christians were struggling with. What will they say about us? What do you think? Will they say that we were Gnostics and struggling with mysticism and Jewish traditions mixed in with Christianity, or will they say something else? What's the opinion?
The similarity to Gnosticism is that we live in a society that's trying to blend all kinds of philosophies and cultures and religions and tolerate them all at the same time, which is impossible. And I think that is a characteristic of the age.
Yeah. Tim?
Creation of our own God is similar to what Drew's saying, that we want to create God in the image we choose.
Yeah.
The collective we, right? The world.
Yeah. That makes sense.
What Drew said makes me think of the bumper stickers that you see that say coexist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just blending it all. Nobody's right, nobody's wrong.
Right. Nobody's elevated. Nobody's beneath. Go ahead, Jim.
I think also we see that we change religion to fit our lives instead of changing our lives to fit our religion.
Yeah.
And I think that's obvious with all the different denominations, with different ideas and beliefs, but yet we all say we believe in Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, no such thing as conviction. Bill, go ahead.
I have this book written by the late brother Tom Holland, and the name of it is Man's Worship to God. And he says in his book that the church must never give in to the whims of our culture.
Yeah.
Seems like maybe we're doing that today. And I don't know, back then, I don't know what they did, but now
It's very fitting to what they were struggling with.
look around and see what's going on in the churches today.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I thought about too, just to add to everything that was mentioned, which is really interesting, is just information. I feel like we're in the age of information. Everything is globalized now, and you can, if you want, you can really understand. You can learn about whatever you want to learn about. It doesn't matter which corner of the earth it started or that information was created. You can get your hands around it. And so just like there were contextual things in Colossae and in other areas of the church in the first century that kind of, because of these things that spun up and happened, it all kind of mixed together, and new ideas, new thinking that were a distraction to the mission of the church happened. I think that's exponentially been compounded because of information. And so I think, we're in the information age now, and that really has an impact on the way we work, on the way we think, and on the way that we worship a lot of times. So that's one thing I thought of, is just information and the information age we're in. It's interesting to try to think about, how people will think about us a century from now. And also it's humbling at the same time and concerning. Key themes. There are several key themes. I think I overdid it on key themes. I've got 7. But I think they are interesting. I won't read all of these just because of time. But the first one I have here is that we have been rescued from darkness and forgiven of sin. This is in chapter 1, verses 13 through 14. So we've been rescued and forgiven from sin. Again, Paul wants them to remember. Verses 21 through 23, we are reconciled to God through Christ. So it's almost like Paul is giving them the basics once again. Really wants them to understand the basics. Verse 1, chapter 1, 27, Christ in us is the hope of glory. Fourth key theme here, chapter 1, 22, and then chapter 2, 10, also verse 13 of chapter 2. Christ reconciled us to God. In Him we are complete and forgiven. So again, you can see really Paul pushing the things that they were struggling with and getting them to balance out what is right. Chapter 3, verses 12 through 14, we are representatives of God. And so as people see us, they should see Christ and God. Chapter 3, verse 15, let the peace of God dwell in our hearts. And 3, verse 23, very popular verse, do everything as we are doing it for God. Those are the key themes that we'll take a look at as we study. Key truths. Jesus deserves first place in our lives. We talked about that quite a bit this morning. Jesus' victory on the cross empowers us to overcome spiritual darkness. That comes from chapter 2, verse 15. 3, verses 1 through 4, our minds are to be set on those things that have eternal value. Again, you kind of see what Paul is really pushing on them. Chapter 4, verse 6, words of our mouth are powerful and should be filled with grace. I mentioned the key verse that a lot of people mention as kind of the key or the thesis of this letter. Chapter 3, verse 1, if then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. So, in the first part of the letter, Paul wants them to remember. Once you get to chapter 3, verse 1, he challenges them. So he kind of sets a foundation in what they should know, reminds them of everything, and then in the first part of chapter 3, he challenges them. He says, if all these things happen for you, if Christ sacrificed everything on your behalf, if you've been raised up with Christ, be like Christ. Set your mind on things that are eternal. Look above. So that's a great key verse for us. And then last of all, I feel like I went kind of list crazy, but Christ is superior. Chapter 1, 1 through 2, you have freedom in Christ. 2, verse 4, and then if you're creating an outline, what is the lifestyle of faith? So in chapter 3, again, you start seeing Paul change to challenging the Colossians. First 2 chapters, he's really talking about, everything that has been done on their behalf. And then once you get to chapter 3, he starts challenging them with things he wants to see them do. And then closing greetings. A good part of the book is about closing greetings, just because it's such a short book. And in verse 7 of chapter 4, he starts talking about, the things that kind of he'll be doing, and Onesimus and Tychicus, what we talked about earlier. So I hope you're excited about the study. We don't get a chance to take just a short book like Colossians and really drill into some of the things. But, this morning hopefully showed you that there's quite a bit to study here. And so we'll start in the first chapter next week. We'll probably divide the book into two major sections. Again, those sections that I described earlier that we feel like are the key themes. Before we close out, anybody have any other comments or questions? All right. Thank you for your help this morning. Thanks for coming.